the things that I'm really interested in this topic, and it was something that I proposed to our company about doing some thought leadership in this area, which has actually flourished now into kind of an offering that makes up part of our stakeholder engagement practice area. So it's something that we run with clients for individual organisations, but also for sectors. So like in this case, the PR sector, and it enabled us to kind of really look at what do employees want and hear it kind of from the horse's mouth. What are they struggling with and what do they need from employers? So it's been really great to be able to support the PR industry with this, and we've really enjoyed working on this report. So I hope you find the findings interesting. So just moving on to what our audit covers. Sorry, I'm just minimizing my face because I could just see myself. So basically kick off with this Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, and it's an academically validated measure of wellbeing, and it has 14 positive statements in there. They're each scored from a scale of 1 to 5, so from all of the time to none of the time. So an example would be, I feel optimistic about the future, and people say whether they felt that all of the time to none of the time over the past 2 weeks. We're then able to sum the statements together, so the score from each statement together, and it gives a score out of 72. And the higher the score, the better mental wellbeing. And we'll see that in action a little bit later, and Isobel's going to show you how the scores have changed year on year. Then moving on to kind of overall mental wellbeing, so ask people about their experiences of poor mental and physical health, so we can compare kind of the dichotomy that exists between the two and the kind of differences that we see there, and how this has actually impacted their work, as well as if they've taken days off for it and kind of their feelings and attitudes around taking time off as well. And then looking at mental health at work specifically, we ask about stress, the sources of stress, stress levels, as well as kind of attitudes towards mental wellbeing at work and opening up. And then we ask people who've experienced struggles with their mental health if they spoke to anybody at work about that, and what kind of reactions they gauged if they did open up, and if they didn't open up, why was that, and kind of trying to understand the barriers behind why people haven't opened up. And then we look at support at work, so the different initiatives that people have access to, whether they're using them, whether they find them helpful, and whether there's anything else they want to be offered to support their mental wellbeing. And then this year, what we've done is we've included the COVID-19 module, just a few questions around whether people are feeling supported at work by their employer, but also focusing quite heavily on their experiences of working from home, as it's quite a big drastic change that we've seen to our working practices and how that's impacted mental well-being, and whether people want to continue working from home as well. And then a light touch on return to the office. So we also ran the study amongst UK audience as well, to kind of get a gauge on how this compares to workers at an overall level versus kind of the PR industry. But we've also got the data from last year, so in a lot of places we just compared to the data last year because that's kind of the most applicable and the most interesting findings there. So let's get into the nitty gritty. Just to kick off with though, I want to say a big thank you to everybody who completed the survey. It took place between June and July this year, which seems to have flown by this year. And we had a great response, 404 responses. We had that from across the whole industry, in-house, agencies, freelance, and falling into other as well. And that's great, so thank you, because it wouldn't be possible to do this without people actually taking part. So from our findings, there was a lot of data that came out of the report, and you've just seen what we run through in the audit. So we had a lot to play with, and we've come up and distilled it down to 3 key recommendations that we have for employers to help improve mental well-being of employees in PR. And our first recommendation here is the importance of sharing stories. So I'm just going to quickly run through these very briefly, and then myself and Isobel are going to run you through the stats in more detail that lie behind these recommendations. So the importance of sharing stories, what we'll see is that there have been great improvements in attitudes around mental health and how to talk about mental health in the workplace and employers taking it more seriously. But in reality, people aren't actually taking time off for their mental health when they are struggling, and so there's a bit of a disconnect there around what kind of people are saying and what they're doing, and that's something that kind of I think needs to be tackled by a cultural change, which does take time. But we think that sharing stories is definitely a way that will help that, and Isobel's going to go through that in more detail. And then we're looking at promoting existing initiatives and introducing new ones. So what we see is that it's great, lots of employers are offering mental wellbeing initiatives, and also what we'll see is that there are specific initiatives that have a very good impact on mental wellbeing scores, and so you see that there's actually demonstrable impacts on mental wellbeing, so it is worth employers investing in these initiatives. But there are some initiatives that aren't offered yet, or are offered by very few employers, and employers are wanting to see these introduced. And then learning from the lockdown, so looking specifically kind of working from home and how that's impacted people and what employers can take out of that. What can we learn from this experience, and is there anything that we can take from the elements of kind of working from home, which we enjoy, around kind of flexibility, which seem to really have a demonstrable impact on mental well-being and make that more permanent when things are back to normal. So those are 3 recommendations we're going to run through. So I'm going to hand over to Isobel, who's going to run through the first recommendation around the importance of sharing stories.
Perfect, thanks Sophie. So firstly, I'm just going to take a quick look at the overall mental wellbeing scores, which Sophie mentioned earlier, and essentially the higher score equals a higher mental wellbeing. So at an overall level, we've seen a slight decline in mental wellbeing scores since 2019, from 45.5 to 43.5, and that brings the PR industry slightly further away from the benchmark of the UK worker. And then if you look on the other side, in terms of how many PR professionals have struggled with their mental health, almost all, so 90%, have struggled with their mental health, which is a pretty similar picture to 89% last year. So we can all relate to this report, and luckily it's not all doom and gloom, as we have seen that we are becoming more open in general about mental health problems and the need to take time off. So we see that almost 3/4, so 72%, have told their employer their exact reason for taking time off for mental health, which is versus only 40% last year. So this is an encouragingly huge increase in those that are actually being open with their employer and sharing their experiences. And actually, those people who did speak up have seen the benefits. So firstly, we've asked how many respondents have told someone at work about their mental health problem. And again, we can see an encouraging increase from the 43% last year up to 59% this year. So well over half are sharing their experiences with those in their workplace. And then on the right, we asked those that have shared with someone at work what their experiences were like opening up about their mental health at work. And again, we've seen some encouraging changes from last year. So just to focus on a couple of them here, looking at the top one, 72% have found that their employers were understanding and supportive, which is up from just over half last year. And then also looking at the bottom one, it's also very encouraging to see that this has dropped down to 10%. So for those that found that their employer didn't actually take their mental health as seriously as they should have, this is now down to 10%, whereas last year it was at a fifth, at 22% last year. And so we're seeing that in general, attitudes around mental health have seen the largest improvements. So again, here we asked all respondents about how they feel about mental well-being generally in their workplace. And again, here we've seen lots of increases. So I'm just going to focus on a couple that stand out particularly here. So the amount of PR professionals that feel that their colleagues would be supportive if they were struggling with their mental health has increased to 73% from 65% last year, which is a great increase. And then also the number of PR professionals that believe that their workplace will take their mental health of their employees seriously is up to 64% from just over half last year. So some really encouraging increases around mental health acceptance in general. However, yet there has also been a decline in the number of PR professionals who are actually taking time off. And again, workload is still being quite a key contributor. So the number of those who have taken time off for mental health has decreased from 31% last year to just over a quarter, 26% this year. And then when we've probed further and asked people what the reasons were behind them for not taking off time for mental health reasons, the contributing reasons are having too much work for just under half, 48%, or not feeling that their mental health problem was bad enough for a day off, which is a similar proportion, 46%. Now, having a more open conversation about mental health in the workplace and sharing stories amongst those who have benefited from taking time off and opening up at work will help them with this much needed culture shift. And yet there's still work to do in terms of changing attitudes towards mental health in the workplace. For example, amongst those who didn't share with their employers, 46% didn't do so because they didn't think it was necessary. 31% didn't tell anyone because they just didn't know how to talk about it. And a similar proportion, 30%, didn't tell anyone because they were embarrassed. And this one is up from 18% last year. So there's quite a large increase in people who are not feeling comfortable or feeling embarrassed about sharing their mental health. And then when we asked people to explain in a little bit more detail why they didn't tell anyone, the general themes included believing that sort of workload, stress and pressure are part of the job and part of agency life. And therefore that almost becomes a blocker for sharing amongst those who haven't told anyone. And we believe this can be helped by people sharing experiences, which will hopefully encourage those who haven't spoken out to share too. So yeah, just in summary, there's been a slight decline in mental wellbeing scores and the culture has started to shift. So attitudes in general have seen the largest improvements, yet there's also this other side where there's been a decline in the number of PR professionals who are actually then taking the time off. And workload's still a big contributor. So yeah, having a more open conversation can hopefully help bridge that gap and help with the culture shift.
Great, thanks Isobel. So I'm just going to run you through our final two recommendations. So our next one's all about initiatives promoting the existing ones that are in the workplace, but also introducing new ones as well. So looking at what people have access to currently, working from home, space for taking breaks and flexible working hours are the most common that people have access to in the workplace. Although if you look at it, actually 54% are actually offered flexible working hours, so there's still half who aren't offered this. And actually what's really interesting, what we're able to do and the power of this Warwick Edinburgh mental wellbeing scale that I was talking about earlier is that we can then look at this mental wellbeing scores of people who have used these initiatives and look at actually how effective are they in increasing mental wellbeing. And what we see is that particularly remote working and flexible working hours have the biggest impacts on mental wellbeing. So here in the green bars we've got the wellbeing scores of those who use the initiatives, but in the grey we have people who have not used the initiatives, and we see across the board of these 5 initiatives that all of them have had demonstrable impacts on mental well-being. And although they're not really in percentages, so it might seem like a small difference, but this is like a significant difference in these mental well-being scores here. So it's definitely something employers should be investing in because it does impact employee mental well-being. And then kind of looking ahead to what do employees want to see introduced in their workplace to support their mental well-being. What we see is that actually duvet days have come up again, so duvet or mental health days, which is taking a day off. You know, you don't kind of no questions asked because you know you're not just feeling up to it today, you're feeling low or down. And that's 58% of PR professionals would like to see that introduced in their workplace, and that was also top last year too. Access to a counsellor is also in there, and monitor of mental wellbeing via a staff survey. So there are still initiatives that employees want to see, but actually in practice, when we do look at if any employers are offering duvet days, the percentages are very low. And so this one's quite short and sweet. Actually, our recommendation summary here is, you know, if employers aren't already offering initiatives, they should do so, and they should look at what do their employees want, and also maybe look at those ones that we've recommended as having the most demonstrable impacts on mental well-being. Those are, you should keep offering those initiatives to your employees, but also for everybody, there's always room for more, and looking to introduce more initiatives and speaking to your teams to understand what is going to help them and what is going to help improve their mental well-being is always best. And then our final recommendation is all focused around learning from the lockdown and the experiences that we've had over the past 6 months. Is it 6 months? I don't even know how long this has been going on now. So when we look at working from home in particular, before the pandemic, we asked people like, how were you working from home before this kind of all happened? And actually only 47% of PR professionals were working from home before this point, and actually for the majority of those people, they were working from home some of the time, so not the extreme that we currently have, where the whole of the industry is working from home, and for a lot of us that is also full-time. So it's kind of a big shift, and a big shift in working practices that we've all had to adapt to. And so we wanted to understand, how is this impacting mental well-being? So we asked people, how do you feel that working from home due to COVID-19 has impacted your mental well-being? And we see a real divide here, and I think understandably so when you think of people's differing personal circumstances of where they are working. 42% of people saying that it's decreased their mental well-being, but on the other hand, there is a 40% of people saying it has increased their mental well-being as well. And you know, for a lot of people, sometimes it will, for some elements of working from home are good for your mental well-being, and some elements are less good. So I don't think it's not as clear cut as working from home it's brilliant for everybody, but it's also it can be good for some people as well. And so we delved into that a little bit further. So what is it about working from home that has had a good impact on mental well-being? And 66% think that not having to commute has positively impacted their mental health. I can certainly attest to that. People are feeling more relaxed as well. They're feeling that their work-life balance has improved also. But on the flip side, there are some challenges to that, and it hasn't all been easy. So on the chart here on the left, we see that 63% have struggled to keep in contact with their colleagues while they've been working from home. People are also finding it hard to draw boundaries between work and rest. So for some, like we saw on the previous slide, some people are saying it's improved their work-life balance, but on the other hand, you've also got people saying that it has decreased their work-life balance because they're now, you know, struggling to kind of draw those lines between when am I resting, when am I working, if I'm working in the same room as well. And then working longer hours as well, as Naya mentioned earlier, 51% of PR professionals saying they are working longer hours now that they're working from home, and also feeling isolated from colleagues. And I think that's a big thing, particularly that we saw when we asked people in the open-ended questions, why do you feel that working from home has negatively impacted your mental well-being? For a lot of people, it's missing that kind of human contact that you get when you go into the office. This person here, missing the support, the banter, the humour, and actually the stresses of looking after small children while they're at home as well. Missing the energy that you get from other people as well is also cited, and you know, feelings of isolation, and finding it hard to create those boundaries when you're working, sleeping, chilling out in the same room for some people, and so that's really difficult. So there are definite challenges to working from home, and it's kind of not all a rosy picture for everybody, and not a rosy picture all of the time for those who do say that they like it. But despite all of that, there are 96% want to continue working from home to some degree after lockdown. And actually, for a lot of people, I think it's around 40% of people said they wanted to work from home full time after lockdown. And then most of the rest of the cohort wanted to work from home a few days a week to just some of the time. So I think people want that flexibility, and it's also, I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself, but our recommendation here is basically having a individual approach to working from home and introducing that potentially into wider working practices once kind of all this situation has kind of settled down a bit, and allowing people flexibility so that they can kind of fit work around their lives, because for some people it might really work for them working from home a few days a week. Some people might not like it at all. Some people like it full time. And I think the ability to have that flexibility really does benefit mental well-being in one of the biggest ways, because it really has a massive impact on people's lives. And so, yeah, just to finish off, I think as we've seen in any difficulty, there's also opportunity in the fact that it has been a difficult situation over this past year, but we have seen improvements in the attitudes around mental well-being in the sector, which are really promising to see, but there's still work to be done. And there is still an opportunity here, I think, as well, to re-examine our kind of working practices and what we've experienced during lockdown, and how that can potentially help us reshape how we work in the future, and how that can also benefit employee mental well-being by having a more flexible approach to kind of working hours and kind of working environment as well. And so that's the end of our presentation of the results. So I'll just hand back to Naya, as we're going to go into panel discussion now. Or are we answering questions now, Naya, or at the end?
No, we're going to go into the panel. Can everyone hear me, by the way?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Better? Yeah?
Clearer, better.
Awesome. Okay, sorry about that. I think it's just the AirPods, so I'm just going to go AirPods free. But thank you, Sophie and Isobel. That was great. I think there's a lot for us to unpack there. But before we dive in, I want to introduce the rest of our panelists. So we've got Joel Beckman, who is a strategic communications consultant and a mental health ambassador. We've got Gavin Spicer, who is a managing director at Edelman and is also a mental health FirstAider. We've got Dr. Leslie B. Hammer, who is a professor in the Oregon Institute of Occupational Health Sciences at the Oregon Health and Science University. That was a mouthful. And we've got Sophie again, who has just presented all of this, and she's a senior research executive at Opinium. So thanks everyone for joining us. The first thing that I did want to talk about is stress. So as we've just seen, PR professionals find their job more stressful compared to the national average, and that is in the UK. So workload and poor work-life balance are the main sources of the stress. What can employers do to implement better strategies to combat stress? So Joel, can we start with you?
Sure. My view of this, without wanting to sound too glib, is almost to look at it the other way around. I feel like as an industry, like lots of other industries, we've become incredibly efficient, timesheet oriented. We know all of our metrics about staff output and per client and productivity and so on. And I feel we've got to this very kind of sophisticated point in our business and capitalist world where we're able to maximize everything that we can from our employees, and then afterwards we say, oh sorry, we're working you really hard, here's some yoga. And I would almost sort of come at it the other way around, is rather than combating stress, how can we avoid the stress in the first place, or how can we support our employees and our teams so that they don't get to that point where we're just having to throw them through yoga to make them feel like they're better, that they're going to feel better. So part of that is capacity and resourcing, and making sure that we're not really kind of stretching people to the absolute limit. And as I said in the opening part, we're very good at maximizing our resources. And I think the other part of that is which I think really came through in a couple of points in the presentation that we just saw, is really asking people what they want. Because there isn't like a one size fits all. There's no point in kind of putting together this amazing set of programs and support in place for your teams and your staff if that's not what suits them or that's not what they want. And I think understanding, so from the senior leadership teams, understanding the needs of their specific organisation and their teams, and also from line managers, really getting to know the people in your team and what would benefit them. So that would be my kind of opening gambit.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that you mentioned that people should just deal with the stress to begin with and prevent our employees from getting stressed, because this issue comes up time and time again, and we haven't seemed to crack it at all. And it's sort of accepted that if you work in this industry and many other industries, that just stress is just part and parcel of what you do, which is counterintuitive to all of what we're doing. So thanks for that. Leslie, I think it'd be really interesting to get your thoughts as someone who doesn't work in the industry, but obviously you have a lot of experience in dealing with employers on mental health and employee well-being. So go for it.
Sure. Yeah, so my background, I'm an occupational health psychologist, and for 30 years I've been working with workplaces and studying workplaces and understanding ways that they can really implement programs and policies to prevent, and I think preventative, Joel, is exactly what we want to do, to prevent stress from even happening. Now, obviously, we come at it from a prevention perspective as much as possible, but we also know that stress does happen. We can't actually completely eliminate it. So there are a number of important levers that we have knowledge of from research in organizational sciences and from practice. And those levers are specifically increasing control, decreasing demands, and increasing support. So what does all that mean? Increasing control has to do with some of the issues that we've talked about. Flexibility. It's increasing the ability for employees to choose kind of where they work, when they work, and how they work as much as possible. This obviously there's different constraints to that, but allowing employees to have more discretion in terms of what they do and how they do it is a big factor in reducing stress. The next factor is reducing demands. Again, there are certain constraints in the workplace because certain things need to be done. We have objectives in the workplace, but understanding that the higher demands, the higher level of stress for individuals. And so enabling people to have input in terms of what they do and providing information in terms of how much they actually can take on helps in reducing those demands. So that communication back and forth. Finally, where I have really spent most of my work over the past 15 years is on increasing support. And by that, I have developed training programs focused on supervisors and managers, and that teach supervisors and managers how to be more supportive of workers around work-life balance specifically. Also support around other issues in the workplace having to do with improving health and well-being and safety. But specifically support around work-life balance, I've identified several different factors, and one of which is providing emotional support, as we have talked about, really checking in with employees. Another is role modeling the kind of work-life balance behaviors. So if you want your employees to actually engage and experience work-life balance, you have to show that you're doing that as well, that you shut down at 5 or 6 o'clock or whatever that is, but that you are really paying attention to your own work-life balance. Then there's also instrumental support, which has to do with paying attention to maybe what kind of schedules each individual needs. And as I think Joel mentioned, that some of that is at an individual level. There's not a one size fit all. We can say, yes, flexibility is important, but supervisors and managers touching base with employees to understand the types of schedules and implementing those is instrumental support. And then there's something that my colleague and I call creative work-life management, which really is the importance of realizing that there are objectives and goals and outcomes that are important to the organization, as well as well-being and health of an individual, and that those need to be considered together. So the training that I've developed has led to, I've evaluated it in randomized controlled trials, and when we've trained supervisors and managers on these support level, kind of factors of support, dimensions of support, we actually see 6-month, 12-month down the road, improved health reports of employees, improved performance of employees, reduced turnover intentions of employees, and overall improved well-being and decreased stress. So those are some key levers, and I'll go ahead and let you move on from here, but I can elaborate on other factors later.
Thanks, Leslie. That's really interesting. Gavin, I'd be keen to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of good points made, actually. I think actually listening to Leslie, I think a lot of what she talked about is the journey that a lot of agencies are on now. I think the biggest part of the problem we need to break down is actually the stigma of talking about this in the first place, and actually creating an environment, particularly where junior staff members who are often juggling 5 or 6 different accounts feel that they have the platform to be able to talk about the challenges. I mean, Joel raised an interesting point as well about kind of we are able to see how productive and efficient our staff are, but I think actually, I don't know, I mean, certainly from my experience, we're only just now rolling out a new kind of resourcing platform, which actually allows us to get that data really in real time. And a lot of it is actually reactive. You're looking at it, it's like, oh, we've overserviced this month, this week. And actually that's often too late to kind of combat the stress. So I think being able to measure and like see problems as they're happening in real time will be a big part of it. I think the bigger part of it is actually creating a culture within the agency where people feel comfortable talking about it. And also to Leslie's point as well, we are introducing kind of new training for our leaders in the business and our line managers, which enable them to have easier conversations with their managees around work-life balance, around kind of crunch times at work, and like how we can help them better. But I mean, look, I think COVID has been really interesting. I think it's been a forcing function on not just the PR industry, but on how we work generally. And I think it's raised some really interesting challenges, but I think it's also kind of been quite positive in that I think there's a lot more trust now in employers, in employees to actually work flexibly, and they can do the job and they can do the job well, which I think is a big part of the barrier previously on why people didn't want to work from home. But it's also like, yeah, how do you kind of maintain that momentum, that cohesiveness, and kind of the links between team, that human interaction? We're still kind of learning how to do that, I think.
Thanks, Gavin. And finally, Sophie, as someone who knows this data inside out, do you have any final thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I think what Leslie was saying about, you know, managers having training to actually support people is so important. And we saw in a lot of the open data in particular, when we asked people, okay, what do you want your employer to do to support your mental health? There's a totally open question. A lot of people were like, I just want someone to check in with me. I want someone to talk to me, ask me one. And for a lot of people, that's like not the case. Or they say, oh, you know, I think a lot of time, mental health in particular is a bit of a funny subject to bring up. People don't really feel quite comfortable with. They're not sure how to talk about it. If they haven't experienced really poor mental health themselves, it's also quite uncomfortable because you're like, I'm not sure how to approach this. Is it appropriate? And I think that training really helps. I've been on mental health aid training, and that was amazing. And kind of helps you really think about, okay, just basically ask the person, what do they need? What do you need right now? And I think that's really come out of the data, and in particularly in the open ends, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's really important when we approach this topic. It's essentially you have to treat your employees as human beings. You know, I think people often forget that and forget that they're having a conversation with an actual human being. And that's why I think it's really important to even, you know, break the taboo on mental health. It becomes, you know, it's great to have these initiatives, but if your employers aren't using them, then it kind of defeats the purpose. So it's about raising awareness and having these open conversations, but also getting that support at the same time. Thanks, everyone. So this following issue came up in our discussion last year, and it continues to shock me. So there's been a decline in the number of PR professionals who struggled with their mental health and took time off for this. And most practitioners cited workload as a reason for not taking time off. This is also the main reason we are stressed. So it seems like a never-ending vicious cycle, which is clearly unhealthy. So what can we do, and what can employers do to address this? Leslie, I'd be keen to get your thoughts on this, and for you to further elaborate on what you were talking about earlier.
Sure. Well, I think it ties in with what we were, with everything that we've been discussing. And part of how employers can help in decreasing those demands and in really reducing those demands and helping people to feel like they actually can take off time is to be aware and in touch. And I want to kind of tag on a couple things that Sophie said and also that Gavin said. Sophie basically said, it's really just kind of checking in and seeing how employees are doing. And again, I put a lot of expectation on supervisors and managers, because supervisors and managers are clearly shown to have the biggest effect on employee health and well-being. And so that can be a positive thing, but it can also be a negative thing. And so if supervisors and managers really know, and this is where it's interesting, because it's you can't just say, well, be more supportive. What does that mean? And as Sophie said, well, it really means checking in, doing well-being check-ins, talking to them, having more communication, as Joel said. This is not, and I always say that this is not rocket science. However, the training of the supervisors and managers is critical, because while some supervisors and managers get it already, a lot don't, and just need a little bit more information on why it is important to be checking in and finding out how your employees are doing. And as Gavin mentioned, there's also this issue of stigma. So it's important to be able to reduce the stigma associated with mental health challenges, with the stress that people are experiencing. And if that stigma is reduced, it will be easier for employees to then take the time that they need, use their mental health days or their paid time off days, as we call them. But it's really around this culture and teaching the leadership and supervisors and managers why this is important to be supportive, why it's important to be checking in, why it's important to help to reduce the stigma so that employees can feel more comfortable taking time off when they do have mental health challenges, because they're going to. We know that. And now more than ever with COVID, as your data has shown.
Yeah, absolutely. Gavin, I'd be keen to get your thoughts on it, as as someone who works for a big employer, but you're also a mental health first aider. So it's quite an interesting balance that you have there.
Yeah, I've been a PR professional a lot longer than I've been a mental health first aider. So I've got a sort of 25 years and 2 months in balance. But I think the listening is a big part of it as well. And I think we have only recently introduced a mental first aid program in Edelman. There are 16 of us, and I think over time there will be more of us. And I think the important thing is we're spread across the business at different levels in different teams. So I can understand that my team might find it quite difficult to come to me to talk about some of these problems, but actually somebody from another team might find it easier. So I think having that as a resource, I think will only help. And it's often easier as well, not speaking to a line manager or a direct lead as well, being able to get some outside perspective and somebody within the business that can understand what you're going through but isn't directly working with you, I think will also help. I think on the part about stigma, we're not going to remove that overnight. And certainly at Edelman, we listen in other ways as well. So we've upped the frequency of our PCON surveys during lockdown to try and get a pulse of like how people are feeling. And we can obviously drill down into kind of people are saying kind of things that are flags, and like kind of HR can ask if they want to talk about it, but it also gives us a general kind of view of how the business is feeling. We've also in our D&I census as well kind of uncovered like how people are feeling. And look, this is all part of it. I don't think we're going to fix this overnight, but when we're taking important steps and giving people different forums, be able to speak up. And like, look, I think there was one thing that jumped out at me in one of the slides earlier, which was, oh, it's just agency life. The other thing is there's this kind of like long used like, oh, it's PR, not ER. But sometimes like when you are like juggling a kind of massive client issue, or what seems like a massive client issue might not necessarily be, but crisis issues, you've got a huge launch coming up, you're a junior juggling kind of 8 different accounts, it can often feel like ER. And I don't think that we should joke or sort of accept that that is agency life, or joke that it's not, doesn't feel the same as ER to some people as you're going through it. So I'm not sure I answered the question, but I think it's like, look, we're on this journey and we're not suddenly going to fix it. But I think providing people different opportunities to speak, but listening as well is a key part of it.
Yeah, and I think, you know, agency life as we know it has dramatically changed since March, and we just need to accept that. And I think it's an opportunity for us to make some positive changes to the way that agency life may not work. So that's really interesting. Sophie, we had this conversation last year, and it comes up again, and it's probably going to come up for the next few years. But I'd be keen to get your thoughts on this, because you obviously know the data really well, and have been doing this for years.
Yeah, I mean, we see the same pattern in market research. So we run this study in the market research sector, and we ran it UK, US and Australia this year, and you see the same pattern. It's workload is the top cause of stress, and it's the top reason people don't take time off usually in most sectors. I think kind of from a personal perspective, you can be really stressed with workload, and if you go and speak to someone about it and you say, I'm really stressed with my workload, can you help me prioritize? Is there anything that can be like deprioritized, taken off me? But if there aren't those processes in place to go and speak to somebody, or like your line manager, for instance, and they're not able to do anything, then it's a bit like we need to encourage people to speak up when they are overloaded, but also stop them getting there in the first place, via kind of those capacity management systems. I mean, which is totally easier said than done, and particularly I think in smaller businesses have a different challenge to larger businesses. So Opinion, we've got 50 people, so it's that challenge of kind of weighing up recruiting more staff with having too many people, but also not wanting to overload people. And so we have to manage that quite carefully and have quite I've lost my words this evening, have quite, I guess, comprehensive systems in place. So we have like groups of 5 people, and one person will kind of check in with their capacity twice a week. So I think it's those sorts of things. And again, it's coming back to these check-ins, checking in with people, checking how they are, and particularly when we're working from home, I think not letting people just kind of get lost, and they're just working away until 12 o'clock at night, and nobody knows because no one can see them. And if you're not checking in, you don't know that. So I think that's something we need to really be mindful of, and particularly as we're going to potentially be working from home for a little bit while longer yet. So I think that's something, yeah, just one of the other things that I think came out of this with the working from home aspect, that just adds a whole extra layer of complexity of not being able to actually see people.
Yeah, and we'll definitely touch on the whole working from home aspect, which is a new challenge. But Joel, I know you touched on this topic earlier, but I'd want you to elaborate on this a little bit more if you can.
Yeah, I've got millions of thoughts buzzing through my head at the moment. And Gavin, I should also say that I am an ex-Edelman employee of about the same term that you mentioned before. So I've got a bit of experience in this as well. I also in previous roles developed workplace wellbeing programs for companies in a couple of charities as well. So I think that there's ironies abound here in that we work in a comms sector, but actually one of the things that we've been sort of touching on, and I think is important, is language. And we all know that kind of dichotomy between someone who's really, really good at PR, but a terrible line manager or a terrible people manager, or people that are fantastic with, but we also know people that are brilliant line managers. And we know it's a bit like when you had that amazing teacher at school. We know that when we've had an incredible line manager that's really understood us, supported us, and inspired us and helped develop us, that makes a massive difference. But I think we struggle with the language. And if we're talking what I call kind of clinical or mental health language, if we talk too much about things like stigma, or if we talk too much about in those kind of terms, but actually the most important thing as line managers, which I think was again identified as a key thing, is having the emotional intelligence to be able to talk to your teams and understand what it is that is important to them. It doesn't mean that we all have to be kind of qualified psychologists or analysts, but just having a little bit of human and personal insight, which I think again was it's not rocket science approach. So that would be my comment about this. I think the numbers, as kind of Sophie outlined them, I'm not surprised we're going into a massive recession. I think when we're going into the type of working environment that we've got at the moment, people are going to be less likely to want to take time off work when their jobs may be at risk, and we know that there's redundancies around the corner. So I'm kind of not surprised by the numbers on this specific topic. I think the other 2 points that I wanted to make were one that came up just related to the last thing that I said about emotional intelligence of line managers, that came up in the research was about stories. And I think the stories, personal stories about people's own experiences are really important. But I think when that comes from leadership team and line managers, it's even more important and more powerful and persuasive, because I think it gives people permission. It's one thing for a young or relatively inexperienced member of staff to talk about their experience, but I think if it comes from the top or it comes from your line manager, I think that's really important. Yeah, I think that's probably enough from me on that question for now.
Thanks, Joel. I want to move on to working from home. I know we briefly talked about this, but we're going to be working from home in the UK for at least 6 months, if not longer, who knows. And I think there are some positives of working from home. I can definitely attest to that. And I think Sophie mentioned this earlier, but, it has negatively affected people's mental well-being, and people are reporting that they're feeling isolated and missing that socializing that you have with colleagues. And, it can be a very tough environment. So what can employers do to maintain a supportive workplace culture during this time? Gavin, let's get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, it has been interesting times. I think the thing is constantly on my mind is like, how do you kind of keep that emotional connection with teammates and amongst the team? And I think we probably went too far down the let's put another Teams call in, let's do another check-in, let's do another huddle, let's like do a bake-off and then get online and show everyone like at the beginning of lockdown. And I think we're getting into a better rhythm, but I think it is something that's constantly on my mind, particularly now as we're getting into one of our kind of busiest periods with our client Microsoft. I think again, like the checking in and like kind of being visible and kind of letting people know that you're there and you're also going through kind of the same things that they are is important. We are kind of having regular check-ins and trying to kind of keep that social aspect alive as well, and looking at kind of how we can try and bring some of that kind of feeling back, but also as well, like making sure that the office is safe for people if they do want to be here as well is a big part of that. I mean, I'm actually speaking from the office. I mean, I've got probably a much more suitable kind of home office setup than a lot of people in the industry who are in shared houses or working out of bedrooms. I've had stories of people using an ironing board as a desk, which is obviously not ideal as well. And I think actually making it safe and kind of creating the environment in the office where people, if they do need to be here or want to be here, is as important as like kind of trying keeping that connection alive when everyone's working remotely.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was definitely a flurry of activity at the beginning of lockdown. And, you know, personally, that really overwhelmed me. Being, you know, that amount of screen time is never good for you. And I definitely felt the effects of that. So I think, you know, people are finding their natural groove with things now. But Leslie, I'd be keen to get your thoughts, given that you're, you know, working in the US and having different conversations, or maybe you're having the same conversations with employers about this.
Well, one of the biggest issues that I personally have been kind of paying attention to has to do with working parents, and working parents who are working from home and their kids are at home, or that if they have, you know, school age and younger kids, their kids are probably in the house, and they're having to educate their kids, care for their kids. All of those together has been unbelievably stressful. And in the US, at least, it's been shocking to me that there really is not much discussion about how the expectations need to be adjusted, need to be probably lowered a bit, because people can't keep just doing it all. I mean, it's sort of, it's this expectation that parents especially are not supposed to miss a beat. And I think it's outrageous. I actually am a work-life scholar. I've been studying work-life issues, work-family issues for 30 years. And I know the stress that workers are experiencing around work and non-work. And those stressors, especially now due to children and having to manage the children at home, are insurmountable. So I think that there is a need for employers to also understand that many employees can't do as much. They just simply can't. And if they're expected to, it's going to negatively affect their mental health. The other thing is that we also need to be talking about what can individuals do themselves. I mean, it's really important that people are taking care of themselves during this time in terms of sleeping, getting the appropriate sleep, getting the appropriate nutrients, and exercise. You know, I think that in some areas, I mean, the gyms are closed. We're not able to go to gyms. So people are not as creative sometimes in terms of figuring out how to exercise, but that really needs to be encouraged, so that individuals, at least they should be encouraged to do certain things to continue their well-being. And that also means that coming back to work, there needs to be flexibility in work hours. I have employees who have young children, and sometimes what has to happen is they cannot necessarily do all the work between 9 and 5 or whatever. And some of them are, you know, have to do work at 1 o'clock in the morning, unfortunately, 3 o'clock in the morning. And there needs to be an understanding that that's okay if that's how they have to kind of manage it. So it's multiple levels. But at the organizational level, I really think that there needs to be an understanding that expectations cannot continue to be at the same level. It just simply can't.
Thanks, Leslie. And, we're actually going to talk about what individuals can do to maintain a sort of work-life balance. So thanks for raising that. So we'll move on to that next. But before we do, Joel, what are your views on this?
I think this is a really hard one. I think for larger agencies and larger companies, if they're able to have some space in their office open, I think giving staff the option of what works for them is really important, because there are some people that working from home works for, because they have long commutes or they've got families or kids and so on. And there's some people who really, really do not want to be in their home. And that might just be because they're in a shared house and they don't want to be sitting around a shared dining room table with their housemates or working off an ironing board. Or it might be because a lot more serious reasons, because some people have got very complicated or a vulnerable situation at home, and they need to be able to have that outlet of being in the office. And I think really progressive, smart employers have made some space available for staff members who are in those situations. I agree with all that Leslie said about working parents, and as a father of an 11 and a 7-year-old boy, I will just give my personal anecdote that I found it unbelievably difficult through the earlier stages of lockdown. It's funny, having worked in mental health comms and mental health campaigns for the last few years, it's again another irony that it would only be the following week that I would look back on the previous week and go, oh, I was a wreck last week, and I was not in any way coping with what was being thrown at me, or how I was then manifesting that with how I was talking to my kids. And it was really hard. And equally seeing, you know, your 7-year-old son really struggling and, you know, not having necessarily the language or the ability to express what he was going through not being in school, it's really challenging. And it's funny, people deal with it in different ways. So for example, I went for a 20-minute walk at lunchtime today with my partner, and she was talking about how some people found that period incredibly blissful, because they were able to be at home with their families, and they were sort of cocooned from this horrible thing that was going on in the outside world. But a lot of people found that really difficult. And I agree with your point about what the expectations on working parents should be. My other point, 2 very quick points, is one of the most kind of progressive organisations when it comes to mental health in the UK is Lloyds Bank, and that very much stems from their chief executive, who had his own very public issues with mental health. And if you read anything that he's talked about, he talks about sleep as being the single most important factor in looking after your mental health. And it's a really important thing. And I won't go into all of the stuff that we know about blue light and screens and so on. And the other point that I would make is, I think we had an unbelievably fortuitous scenario for the last 6 months, in that by and large the weather in the UK was amazing, and we were able, for those people that wanted to and were able to, we were able to go outdoors and exercise and walk and have some fresh air, without wanting to put too gloomy a note on it for a mental health panel discussion. I think this winter is going to be a very long winter, and I think people do need to find routes to be able to get fresh air, to get exercise as it gets colder and darker. I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but I think it's important for people to find their own way to be able to do that.
I think it's so interesting that you mentioned that, because I've had the same concerns about the weather in the UK and about it getting colder. And I actually had the best summer just, you know, being out in parks and taking advantage of all the greenery in London. But, you know, even today I went out for a short walk. It was not even 10 minutes, and it definitely improved my mental health and just my mood. So I think it's really important that, you know, despite the weather getting worse and it raining all the time in London and the UK being unpredictable, it is important just to get outside and have that fresh air. Sophie, any final thoughts on this?
Actually, just touching on your guys' points about like getting outside, I think it's so important to just like go for a walk in the day. Also, I'm really bad at taking my own advice, so I need to be better at that, because I would just go, oh, I'll just have my lunch and then I'm just back to work, and then, oh, I'll go for a walk after work, and then I'm like, oh, it's dark. And like, it wasn't an issue in the summer, because you could be like, I'll go out for a walk at like 9 o'clock, it's still light. So I think making that time in the day, and one of the things we've introduced is like wellness walks, which we were doing in person when we were in the office. So we'd all go out for a walk. I think that's what we used to do on a Wednesday, but we've turned them to go remote now. So we go and encourage everybody to go out for a walk and then take some pictures while you're out on your walk, and like sometimes it will be like, who can spot like a cute dog, or like a bit like a treasure hunt. So trying to encourage people to do that, and then also having a social aspect, I think is quite nice, because I think it's a lot of these things, with going back to kind of what can employers do to kind of help people stay connected. I think trying not to overwhelm people, but also like going back to some of the things that we did at the start of lockdown, what worked, and reviewing what actually worked, what really helped people. Was it the check-ins? Was it the pub quiz that everybody was doing, a pub quiz? But those sorts of things, and reviewing, you know, what was actually helpful and what do we think that people engaged with, and trying to maybe reintroduce some of those. And that's what we're doing at the moment, is kind of having a big review of what we did and what we can do over the coming months, because it's winter. I hate winter, but yeah, it's that gloomy time. It's the dark, and I think, yeah, I think a lot of people struggle with that as well. I know from speaking to people, people really struggle with that. So I think trying to keep people's spirits up as we kind of go into that sort of season really helps.
Agreed. I hate winter as well. I don't know many people that do like winter, but actually we've already kind of spoken about this, but I think it's really important to give individuals the tools to, you know, manage their mental health and have a routine and have those sort of self-care moments while working from home. So you guys have all sort of mentioned it, but I think we do need to sort of dive a bit deeper. So Gavin, what are your sort of tips for individuals?
I mean, look, I certainly, over the years, I mean, the comment earlier about leaders talking about mental health challenges, I did it on one of our recent town halls when I introduced mental health first aiders. And because of experiences I've had in the past, I think I've been quite, I mean, look, I get stressed, I get anxious. I'm still kind of working late at night when I shouldn't be sometimes, but I think I've got kind of mechanisms in place which help me kind of separate the work from life pretty well. And on the whole, I think I get a good balance. I think there are certainly things anecdotally that I did during lockdown that we've touched on. I used to kind of maintain the commute. So I used to go for a walk before work, or I went for a bike ride. I did the same thing at the end of the day, but also as well, just little things during the work day as well. And this is something we've actually agreed with our client over kind of lockdown, like ways of working with them, because look, they're going through it as well. We're not unique. All the industries are going through similar things, particularly people who are now working from home. So we've like forced kind of breaks into diaries, which on the whole work pretty well. So we've got a block of time from like 11 till 2 where we don't have any client meetings. It hopefully enables people to get some focused time to work where they're not on calls or doing meetings. Can also potentially have a lunch hour. That's certainly something that was quite new to me over lockdown. It's like, oh God, I'm going to have lunch and I'm going to sit and watch the news. And much as the news was often quite depressing, it was actually a bit of a break. And another little handy tip actually for people is in Outlook, you can adjust the time of meetings. So we've done a lot of work on like, does this person need to be in this meeting, like to try and reduce the back-to-backs, but also reducing times to 25 minutes and 50 minutes in Outlook. So if you are on a day of back-to-back calls and you need a breather, you need a break, you can at least get 5 minutes or 10 minutes between meetings. So trying to kind of build those blocks into the day, I'd say, is something that people really need to do. And all the points around kind of exercising as well. And like, look, we will try and do what we can to make sure employees are not working too hard. They are maintaining a work-life balance, but I think people need to feel empowered to be able to close the lid at the end of the day, not think they need to be on emails from the minute they roll out of bed to the minute they go to bed at night as well. So trying to empower people that they can manage their work and life and give them kind of tips on how to do that, I think is something that we need to keep doing.
I think that's a really helpful tip around meetings, because I've definitely experienced meeting fatigue, and my partner has been in meetings back to back since 1 p.m. and it's exhausting for me seeing him go through that. So I can only imagine how exhausting it is for him.
As we've actually created a kind of charter between us and the client now, and introduced new ways of working, and like really conscious. But look, work-life balance is tough when you're in the office anyway, but certainly at home it's become even tougher. And like agreeing with them, like we need to hold each other to this. And if we start abusing it, you need to tell us. And if you start abusing it, we'll tell you as well, to try and kind of maintain that balance.
Yeah, great. Joel, you mentioned sleep earlier, and I obviously agree with you, but are there any sort of tips that you want to share with the audience?
I don't know how commonly known this is, but I might be relaying an anecdote which everyone's heard. But if you ask Netflix who their major competitor is internally, and I don't think they'd say this externally, the answer is sleep. And so I think one thing is just as good as that documentary or box set or whatever it is that you're watching is, you don't have to watch it till 11 o'clock at night. So that would be one thing. The other thing is meditation, and I'm gonna just say the meditation. There's a lot of kind of science and nonsense about meditation, but if you boil it down to what it really is, and it doesn't have to be expensive or anything, it's about breathing. And everyone can just take 5 minutes before they go to bed and just breathe. Just take some time to breathe. Of course, if you want to delve deeper, there's lots of apps and there's lots of things and things that you can do. But I would say taking some time to just get into a routine of breathing before bedtime is really important. I'm a bit wary about saying this one because I'm not sure of the science, but there is some research, and I would encourage people to check before they do this, that magnesium is really supports good sleep. And I know lots of people have had very good experience of taking magnesium supplements and helping their sleep.
Great, thank you. Sophie, do you want to share any final tips with the audience? I know you mentioned being outdoors, but anything else?
I think building on Joel's point about blue light, I recently got a blue light filter for my laptop, and it's amazing. I don't have any headaches now. I used to get really severe headaches in the day. I don't get headaches now. It's great, and I'm sleeping better. But I think the other thing is like exercise as well. Helps your sleep so much. So like in the last 4 weeks, I started like exercising like 5 times a week. I mean, that sounds like a lot, but I only do like 20 minutes a day. But I think that really kind of, because I do it also in the evening, which it boosts a load of basically hormones, I think, just without going too much into it, but it boosts a load of hormones in your body that makes you feel ready for sleep. And so that's also really helped. And I'm not even someone who really had issues with sleep anyway, but even I've noticed feeling more refreshed and having more energy. And I think like those sorts of things really help. And it's these little things. When people say self-care, I think there's a lot of like, and there's always bringing back the word stigma up, but it's like there is a lot of stigma of people like, oh, self-care. It's like it's like you feel really selfish. It's not selfish at all. Like, because you need to look after yourself before you can, one, look after anyone else if you're a manager or a line manager and helping someone else with their well-being, but before you can kind of do your job or anything like that. So I think just kind of working out what works for you, whether it's exercise, whether it's, doing some meditation before bed, or like creative outlets as well, I think are really useful too. Some people, so I think it's working out something that works for you, but also not trying to do everything, because you don't need to do everything. It's just working out those few things, and they can be small things, I think, as well, because it's kind of the consistency of them is really important.
Yeah, I would definitely attest to finding something that works for you. And I think at the beginning of lockdown, we had all of these blogs and all these things that you can do to help your mental health and all these self-care tips. And I'm like, I don't want to do half of this. So why would I? And you feel compelled to do it. So yeah, and Leslie, any final tips for our audience? I know you've already touched on this before, but.
I'll just add in, the last research study that I just finished up involved kind of training supervisors on work life, kind of how to support employees around work life and sleep. And so we trained supervisors on some of the important issues around sleep and how they can support their employees. And then we also provided employees with actigraph watches where they track their sleep for 3 weeks, and then we gave them feedback on their sleep in terms of the quality and the quantity. And that feedback aligned with, and in addition to the supervisor training, has really led to the highest level of well-being outcomes that we've seen in all of our research. And some of the, just a few key points that the supervisors were trained on and the employees were told is that most of the population is not sleeping enough. We are sleep deficient, and everybody should get somewhere between 7 and 9 hours of sleep a night, at least. And people need to be paying attention to that. And they're also, one of the important ways of doing that is to have really set sleep times, like go to bed around the same time each night, because when you start really varying that, then the amount of sleep is varied quite a bit. And then we've already talked about the screen time and the screen and blue light. So there are a number of key pieces of knowledge that if people have, they can improve their sleep, they can improve their health, they can improve their well-being. But in the end, as an occupational health psychologist, I truly, truly believe that where people spend at least a third of their time in the workplace, that employers and leaders are really at a key point for improving health and well-being for workers.
Thank you. I think that's a brilliant point to end on. That's it for the sort of panel discussion. If there are any questions from the audience, pop it in the Q&A, and if there aren't any, we can end a little earlier. So I'm going to give it a few minutes for people to put their questions in the Q&A section. And yeah, there were a couple of questions about recording and stuff like that. I'm going to be sharing the recording tomorrow, hopefully, if the tech allows me to. Okay, I guess there are no questions. It just means that you guys were incredibly thorough. So that's great. But yeah, I mean, I want to just thank all of our wonderful panelists for sharing their insights, and all of you for attending and spending your evening with us. I hope you learned something, and hopefully we can action some of the recommendations from the panel and the report. If you haven't checked out the report, definitely give it a read. I am going to share it in the chat function shortly. But my final thought on this is, it can be really easy to get lost in the flurry of activity during dates such as World Mental Health Day and Mental Health Awareness Week, and forget about the issues until the next time. But if we're going to enact real change in the industry, these conversations need to happen on a daily basis. So in the spirit of continuing the conversation, we actually have an event tomorrow morning, so I'll share the details. And I'm going to leave it at that. Oh, there's a question. I mean, if you guys have time, I'm happy to answer this question. So I'll just say, it says, do you think there should be a mental health and well-being certificate for the workplace? Anyone?
Well, in the US, we have, I think it's the Healthy Workplaces Award that recognizes workplaces when they have healthy cultures and programs. I think that any kind of recognition of employers for going the extra mile is helpful, and it's an incentive. So I would say that if there is a way of really disseminating and advertising that and getting it out there and getting participation, I would say yes, that would be beneficial.
Yeah, I would agree. And then Mind do a workplace, is it the Workplace Mental Wellbeing Index? They do every year. And they have an awards as well for it. And I think it's like bronze, silver, gold. And I think we're going to enter that this year because we haven't entered it before. But they give you feedback, I think, as well on like, what can you do? So it's like, okay, great, you've like entered and you're in the index, but like, okay, what are next steps? Because I think it's always looking at, okay, how can we improve and how can we make it better in the workplace? No one's perfect at this. And I think, Gavin, you mentioned it earlier, we're all on this journey of kind of, you know, improving workplace mental wellbeing. Nobody's doing it perfectly. There are some people doing it really well, and some people are just at the start of that journey. So I think we're all at different stages.
No, but I mean, look, I think PR is, we've been fighting about measurement and struggling with how do we measure what we do for years. But I think the Mind Index is something we've signed up to. We have a pledge, and that is something to measure us by. So, but yeah, it's a journey. We're not going to fix this overnight. There are things that we need to do and are doing. But I wouldn't be against the certification. I think, yeah, we need to be measured on what we're doing.
Cool. There's just one final question, and I think we'll just have one question because it's already 6:50. But how do we create a healthy culture around speaking about mental health? Does this start from management? I definitely would agree with it does start from management, but does anyone have any thoughts on this?
I mean, I would say absolutely. It starts with management. I mean, that's how you develop a culture, and it needs to really be ingrained in the management structure, valued by the workplace, and some of that then can be taught to more lower level supervisors to make sure that they're also honoring, and so that's through supervisor training. But it takes time if the culture is not there, and it takes education, but it does start with top management.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think we can all agree on that. And I think Leslie, you made this comment earlier about modeling behavior. So that all comes from sort of senior leaders and management. But I've left some links in the chat function. So there's an event tomorrow morning, and I've also linked our report. And I think, Sophie, will you be sharing the slides later?
Yeah, I can share the slides. I can send them to you now, and you can send them around with the recording.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll do that. That's easy. And we'll share everything as much as we possibly can. And hopefully this recording happens and the tech doesn't fail me like it usually does. But thank you, everyone. This has been really great, and a great way to spend my evening, actually. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you all did too.